Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this, the Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better, and we are currently in a lovely little bit of time right at the start of the middle of the Clown Decade where things are ramping up to get much, much worse. And while this video will mostly focus on the police and Tories, this entire thesis goes through pretty much every institution throughout the United Kingdom because they are all ideologically captured by an ideology with a specific foreign streak, the woke ideology, the American mixed with European liberalism, that has ended up with absolutely every conversation having to effectively go back to, but how does this affect women, how does this affect black people, how does this affect the gays, etc, etc. Conversations that I really don't care about. The only question I want asked is, how does this affect the British? And I think just quickly going through this first story is going to make my point pretty well. Teacher who waved placard depicting Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman as coconuts has been interviewed by police. Mariha Mohsin Hussain has been interviewed under caution over the banner. And it turns out that this woman is a teacher. And it's this exact sort of thing that I'm talking about. Not only is she a teacher, but she is also perfectly fine with putting up racial placards. I mean, this isn't just being somewhat casually racist. This is putting effort in to make a placard where the underlying tone of it is, if you act white, quote unquote, then you are a bad person. And if you think that you can act white or act black, then you need a much higher resolution view of the world, because it is still crazy to me to think that you can act certain skin colours when Owen Jones and Ash Sarkar are basically the same people. But the point being is that if this woman is perfectly happy putting up a placard like this, then God knows what she finds acceptable to tell children that she is teaching. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, yesterday there was a vote in Parliament to decide whether the UK should support a ceasefire over in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza, or whether they should not be in favour of a Gaza ceasefire. And just quickly, the results turn out that there was a majority to not back a ceasefire, so this country is in support of Israel continuing the war, which I have to say I am tacitly on the side of. But it's everything that happened around this vote that really does make my point. I mean, Labour had 10 front bench MPs just leave the front bench because Keir Starmer said to his MPs that anyone who votes in favour of a ceasefire will be at risk of being kicked out of the party. So they're having their own rebellion about a war that's going on around the other side of Europe. The Tories aren't in such a directly bad position as they can't hold their party together on the basis of Israel. They're just having issues holding the party together on domestic issues, such as stopping the boats and actually making the police force act like a police force. And a great example of this is basically everything that Andy No posted yesterday onto Twitter. Here were the scenes outside Parliament during the vote. And according to Andy No, they were there for hours. But it wasn't just outside Parliament where you had mass protests in support of a ceasefire, which I do just want to make clear, this is just a ceasefire for Israel. There is no talk ever of asking Hamas to release the hostages that they took that day. They also killed and injured thousands of Israelis. Anyway, here's Oxford Street. Just thousands of people walking down Oxford Street. You couldn't get a car through there at all. Goodness knows what time it is, but the Tories literally put in legislation that said if you have mass disruption of an area, especially large cities, then the police have the authority to just arrest you and deal with you and get you out of the way so that the city can actually start running normally. And this was going on all over London. Here's Park Lane. Again, just loud beeping, loud Arabic music going on. Here we have a bunch of people presumably out for a meal or something like that, just not being able to remain comfortable. All over London, just complete chaos because of these absolutely huge marches going on by, and I'm usually very fair on this, but there are usually a bunch of white people in these marches, but while I did spot a few, it's nowhere near the half that we're used to seeing at the weekend marches. And unfortunately, these protesters weren't just marching and, well, it seems from the first images there was smoke coming from flares and you should be arrested for setting off flares in a public place, as it is illegal. But again, images from Andy No show that the London had to literally run to the Cenotaph War Memorial as the pro-Palestine march kept breaking off to different places, and they honestly kept going to war memorials. I mean, just watch this. I mean, good stuff, I guess. You have, what, 20 police officers there, I guess, surrounding the Cenotaph as a rather large march starts coming towards it. And, what's the contrast between this and the images we saw at the weekend when the quote-unquote far-right rally was there to protect the Cenotaph? I mean, okay, yeah, the police are there to protect it, but we shouldn't be living in a country where you need police to surround these memorials to protect it. It should just be common and proper for people to not even remotely think of doing anything to war memorials. And also there's a guy in a face covering there. I don't know why the police haven't banned face coverings. In fact, no, let me rephrase that. I know exactly why they haven't banned it. It's because they know they can't enforce it. They are doing their best to keep a lid on these protests because they are probably worried that it's going to end up in violence if they actually do anything useful. Because look at their reaction to when people are actually going up, climbing on monuments and defacing them. Just a community support officer there going, please come down, sir, please come down. And people in the crowd are also saying, get down, you'll get arrested. But the guy's just saying, I don't care. I mean, fair enough, the guy does get down, but why was he up there in the first place? And look what this police officer does. He doesn't arrest him, he doesn't do anything. He just says, come on, get down now, you've had your fun, go away. Literally just let him get away with it. And what was the Met's response to this? It's deeply disrespectful to climb on a war memorial, correct, but there's no law making it illegal. Nonsense. In the absence of a law, officers cannot automatically arrest, but they can intervene and make it clear the behaviour isn't acceptable. That's what they are seen doing in this video. It's just total nonsense that there isn't a law against climbing up onto war memorials. Here is a picture of Charlie Gilmore, David Gilmour's son of Pink Floyd, swinging around on the flags on the Cenotaph back in 2015. Now don't get me wrong, he was doing a hell of a lot more that day, as we will quickly get into, but you will see that the point stands that climbing up on war memorials is part of the charges that were imposed upon him. The son of Pink Floyd guitarist David Gilmour has been jailed for 16 months after admitting violent disorder during a student fees protest in central London last December. Charlie Gilmour was seen hanging from a Union flag on the Cenotaph, and later leaped on the bonnet of a Jaguar car forming part of the royal convoy taking the Prince of Wales and Duchess of Cornwall to the Royal Variety performance that was attacked by demonstrators. He also set fire to papers outside the Supreme Court in Parliament Square and was seen kicking a window of a Topshop branch in Oxford Street and later carrying a leg of a mannequin. Students attacking the store caused £50,000 worth of damage. Now, I am not saying that people who climb up on war memorials deserve 16 months in jail. However, what I am saying here is that clearly part of his charges were swinging from a Union flag on the Cenotaph. In other words, it is illegal to be a moron who climbs upon and plays about upon war memorials. That is clearly part of the charges here. So it's clearly once again just two-tier policing. We've seen it plenty of times. We saw it with the vandalisation of the Churchill statue back when Black Lives Matter protests were going on a couple of years ago at this point. We see it where this teacher has been arrested for carrying a placard saying that Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak are coconuts because it is anti-non-white racism. But you are free to wave around a White Lives Don't Matter placard all you want. Hell, an entire airfield decided that they were no longer going to allow people to fly plane banners after a plane banner was flown saying White Lives Matter over, I believe it was a Burnley game. The airfield just said, no more banners, we can't risk it, it's a bad look. It's a bad look to say White Lives Matter. It's just two-tier policing everywhere, and I mean, the Met Police even came out and said, as of 10:05, the group has dispersed, officers made one arrest for possession of an offensive weapon, so at least have arrested someone for that. I wouldn't be shocked if they stopped and searched more of the crowd, they'd be making many more arrests. But the fact that these marches were going on from about the time the vote for the Gaza ceasefire was happening, which was some point in the mid-afternoon, all the way up until 10 at night, is actually quite crazy. And there are images of the police trying to disperse the crowd to a point where they're not on the roads to let cars through, but it's still crazy to me that, as far as I'm aware, this protest wasn't given the go-ahead by the police, and you need that for the police to accept your protest, otherwise they will stop it. You literally need to ask permission to protest from the police, and they may have had the permission outside of Parliament. I have massive doubts that they had permission to go to Oxford Street and Park Lane. And we've seen it in the past where you were supposed to have a procession for the first pro-Palestine march going on a specific route, and they kept going off it. No one was arrested for it, though. So what's the point in planning it? Anyway, here was yet another Met Police statement about the whole affair. Most people would agree that to climb on or otherwise disrespect a war memorial is unacceptable. This is why our officers have made every effort to prevent it happening in recent days. Hence they're protecting the cenotaph and telling people to get down, I suppose. This evening, a breakaway group of pro-Palestine protesters were dispersed at Hyde Park Corner, and a number of them climbed on the Royal Artillery Memorial. While officers were on scene quickly, we regret they were not there quickly enough to prevent the protesters accessing the memorial. We know some online have asked why the protesters were not arrested, and that's because there is no law explicitly making it illegal to climb on a memorial, so officers cannot automatically arrest, but they can intervene and make it clear the behaviour isn't acceptable. The video shared online showed them doing that. And again, even if Parliament do pass a law that explicitly allows people to be arrested for climbing on these memorials, will the Met enforce them? The answer is obviously only if you are quote-unquote far right, but the far right are never going to do that, so they'll find another reason to arrest them. So yes, it turns out Suella Braverman was absolutely right to point out that there is a two-tier policing system, and now that she has been kicked out of the cabinet and is no longer Home Secretary, I suppose that it is bittersweet that she is still being vindicated for absolutely everything she said about the Met. And now we have James Cleverly in charge, and once again, nothing is going to change. Now, speaking of Home Secretaries, obviously, one of the promises that Rishi Sunak had was that he was going to stop the boats. And it turns out that the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, that we only got in 2009 thanks to Tony Blair, ruled that the Rwanda plan was unlawful. Rishi Sunak has staked his political credibility on pushing through emergency legislation to resurrect his high-profile plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda after the Supreme Court ruled it was unlawful. During a combative press conference on Wednesday afternoon, hastily arranged after the 5 judges unanimously rejected the proposal, Sunak said legislation would end the merry-go-round of legal challenges by setting out in law that the East African country is safe. Great. A complete wrong way to go about it, by the way, but I will get onto that in a second. Because it is exactly this scenario that Suella Braverman laid out in a resignation letter, and I will take the excerpt here. For a year as Home Secretary, I have sent numerous letters to you on key subjects contained in our agreement, made requests to discuss them with you and your team, and put forward proposals on how we might deliver these goals, including, of course, stopping the boats. I worked up the legal advice, policy detail, and action to take on these issues. This was often met with equivocation, disregard, and lack of interest. You have manifestly and repeatedly failed to deliver on every single one of these key policies. Either your distinctive style of government means you are incapable of doing so, or, as I must surely conclude now, you never had any intention of keeping your promise. These are not just pet interests of mine, they are what were promised to the British people in our 2019 manifesto, which led to a landslide victory. They are what people voted for in the 2016 Brexit referendum. Our deal was no mere promise over dinner to be discarded when convenient and denied when challenged. It was clear from day one that if you did not wish to leave the ECHR, the way to securely and swiftly deliver our Rwanda partnership would be to block off the ECHR, the HRA, and any other obligations which inhibit our ability to remove those with no right to be in the UK. Our deal expressly referenced notwithstanding clauses to that effect. Your rejection of this path was not merely a betrayal of our agreement, but a betrayal of your promise to the nation that you would do whatever it takes to stop the boats. In other words, Suella Braverman predicted all of this. She predicted that the Supreme Court would block it. She would predict that there would be many legal challenges in the way because of all these foreign international treaties that we signed up to that we frankly just don't need to be a part of and shouldn't be a part of if it's literally stopping us from deporting illegal aliens. And she just makes it explicit what is going to happen. At every stage of litigation, I cautioned you and your team against assuming we would win. I repeatedly urged you to take legislative measures that would better secure us against the possibility of defeat. You ignored these arguments. You opted instead for wishful thinking as a comfort blanket to avoid having to make hard choices. This irresponsibility has wasted time and left the country in an impossible position. If we lose the Supreme Court, an outcome that I have constantly argued we must prepare for, you will have wasted a year and an Act of Parliament only to arrive back at square one. Boom, that's where we are. Worse than this, your magical thinking, believing that you can will your way through this without upsetting polite opinion, has meant that you have failed to prepare any sort of credible plan B. I wrote to you on multiple occasions setting out what a credible plan B would entail and making it clear that unless you pursue these proposals in the event of defeat, there is no hope of flight this side of an election. I received no reply from you. I can only summarise this is because you have no appetite for doing what is necessary and therefore no real intention of fulfilling your pledge to the British people. My God, I suggest all of you go off and read this entire letter. It is beautiful. But it's completely true, and according to Suella Braverman, there is no credible plan B, and that can only lead me to assume that the plan B to try and force a law through Parliament to say that Rwanda is a safe country isn't going to work. We have completely non-serious people in Parliament and in the Cabinet, and everyone who is serious appears to just get kicked out. Because it honestly must be the most stressful job in the world, being somewhat right-wing, right in the middle of the Home Office, where apparently there were multiple celebrations of people who work in the Home Office after Suella Braverman was kicked out, including people saying, "We are bloomin' happy, you can lean to the right without being a jerk or an incompetent moron. She was like a car continually crashing. She was like a car that veers across motorway lanes, reversing all over the place and continually crashing as a result." That's a pretty offensive thing to say about an Asian woman, I have to say. And Home Office officials celebrate Braverman's sacking. There's plenty of evidence that the Home Office is just absolutely infested to the core with total leftists. I personally know some people who work in the civil service, and I think some in the Home Office, that are active leftists and do appear just to try and undermine any sort of thing that would be beneficial to the UK. These are people that say that the barges the government got to house migrants were some of the worst things they've ever seen. And there are other people in this group chat, by the way, who are in the army, who basically just say that would be seen as luxury to people like me in the army, because the barge was effectively just a Premier Inn. So you might be wondering, especially in Parliament, why it's so full of useless people who appear to want to do absolutely nothing useful and try and take all the politically expedient ways out that clearly never work. Well, Dominic Cummings, who worked with a lot of cabinet ministers, may have an insight into that.
Imagine if Steve Jobs or Tim Cook or Patrick Collison or someone actually spent a large part of their day just doing photo ops as well. You have a person whose time is the single most precious asset. His decisions or her decisions is the only thing that can actually break down the bureaucratic resistance and make sure that something happens. Yet they're actually standing with the ambassador from Tonga Zonga, whatever country, just doing photo ops.
Yes, and this is honestly part of the reason probably why there's a lot of useless people in Parliament, because when you become a cabinet minister, it's just, oh, I need to raise my profile so that hopefully I can do something useful after this, because you've got to bear in mind, they're only expecting to be in that position 5 years at the very most, and that's only if they're lucky. Why would you bother working to that extent to try and do what's best for the country if after 3 years, if say you're Suella Braverman, who did a lot of unpopular things, well, very popular things to the British demos, very unpopular things within the new elite, which is where all the new money is. Why would you expect to get anywhere after you get sacked or kicked out by an ungrateful electorate? And Rishi Sunak was exactly the same. When he was Chancellor, you'd see him on all the Eat Out to Help Out posters. You would see him with a little coin saying Diversity Built Britain, doing all these stunts for the new elite. And when it came down to it, I mean, okay, yes, you had the furlough system during COVID. I suppose that could pay the plebs. But at the same time, you had him raising taxes to the highest tax burden we've had since World War II. And he has overseen an economy that has crumbled. And recently he's tried to say, oh, inflation's been halved, though. That's one thing ticked off the box. But every time you go on Twitter, you always see a community note effectively saying this has nothing to do with the government and everything to do with the Bank of England's decisions. It's entirely just politics of vibes. That is what we have had recently, and that is probably why David Cameron has been brought back. Because almost like Star Wars bringing back Luke Skywalker constantly, or doing a fifth godforsaken Indiana Jones film, you think, oh, look back, David Cameron, all these South-East Tories really like that because they voted for David Cameron back in 2010 or whenever. Totally vibes-based. First thing they did was bring out this picture, by the way, yet another photo up from the Cabinet Office, and it just sums up everything wrong with not just the Tories, every institution we have. I mean, it's very specific for the House of Commons to be full of people doing nothing but photo ops, but then everywhere else it's just all the incentives say do what the new elite do, because if you do get kicked out of this job you will then easily find another. And that's probably exactly what is going to happen to Alison Rose of NatWest Group after she has been kicked out of there for, even though the watchdog says she does nothing wrong, breaking GDPR against Nigel Farage. Anyway, Dominic Cummings had more to say.
These people have all grown up in a system where they just don't know any better than dealing with the media all day. Yeah. Again, one of the funny conversations I had with Boris was I said, we should say to the ministers that here's your actual priorities as defined by us. Whether or not you get promoted and whether or not your career goes well is going to be defined by how well your department actually fulfills these goals.
And this gets right to the heart of the issue. The issue is incentives. We have awful incentives for absolutely everyone who is in charge of us. Because Parliament, don't leave the ECHR, otherwise you won't get a decent job after you leave, because we need to be in a place where we are a bit more globalist, a bit more internationalist. We need an international community. Sod all the nationalist plebs, they don't mean anything. I mean, Boris Johnson was the same, but his photo ops were actually against the new elite, oddly enough, and that's probably why he won by a landslide in 2019. But you've got to look at his life now. He has left politics, he is no longer an MP, and he is doing a stunt on GB News where he's essentially doing a travel show. And that, unironically, is probably because it's all he can get. He's not like Tony Blair, where he got a stint at financial companies. He's not like David Cameron, who did a load of business deals with China, which, by the way, is a very bad reason to make him foreign secretary, by the way. So that's specifically the problem with Parliament. They are effectively just really ugly celebrities who only really do what they do for the good vibes they'll give up while they're in Parliament. I mean, honestly, part of the reason Sunak probably went against the net zero stuff recently by allowing a load of oil and gas companies to have exploration licenses in the North Sea is because he's probably going to do some financing after he is out of Parliament within that sector. I wouldn't be shocked if you got headlines like that after he has been voted out of Parliament, because that's more than likely to happen at this point, despite the fact that Labour appear to be hobbling along as a corpse as well as the Tories. So hey, maybe Peter Hitchens will get his wish. But this is the thing. The title of this video is saying that every institution needs reform, and Parliament needs reform in such a way that it needs to completely change its incentives away from vibes-based politics towards useful politics. But every other institution will be drip-fed different incentives down from Parliament. So Parliament is the more important one, because just to give a quick analysis of the COVID inquiry, I mean, if you ignore the headlines saying that there was a bit of misogyny in the cabinet meetings with Dominic Cummings, pretty much every senior civil servant, and Dominic Cummings himself, is just fully openly admitting that the civil service is in charge of Britain at the moment. And that is because it is impossible to herd the cats of the different departments. Because we have one of the worst systems imaginable, where we have a very centralised parliament with a very centralised tax system, but all of these systems are completely decentralised from Parliament, and they keep splitting, getting different priorities, and effectively, tax alone has about 5 different departments trying to make sense of the tax system in the UK. It is that complicated, and that's why every year you probably know someone who is either owed money by HMRC or owes money to HMRC, because the whole system that's supposed to make it easier and for them to work it out is god-awful and split up everywhere. And so it probably should be first priority of the next based government, for lack of a better term, to firstly obviously change the incentives within Parliament. To, as Dominic Cummings says, you should be trying to improve your department as best you can, and if you do improve it, then you'll get a promotion. Rather than, oh, well done, you didn't look particularly racist when you had that picture with that black group from inner city London or something like that. And then from there, they need to completely streamline the civil service, probably take out well over 75% of civil servants, streamline every department, and actually have senior civil servants and permanent private secretaries be answerable to Parliament and the Cabinet, because at the moment they're just completely not. They're almost completely protected from all liability there, and so they can get away with pretty much anything. I mean, you watch Yes Minister, the writers of Yes Minister got investigated by the civil service because they effectively kept getting Sir Humphrey right, that he would constantly try and undermine the Prime Minister or Minister of Current Affairs or whatever it was, Administrative Affairs, that was it, would constantly influence him to do things that only benefited the civil service and not many other people. And you would see effectively blatant corruption to protect themselves, essentially, and there is absolutely no answering this. to Parliament or the ministers or anything like that. So of course the incentives are just to be corrupt, and there's nothing much we can do about it. And a good way of actually taking away the corruption is taking away the power, streamlining the whole thing, make them answerable to the people who were voted in. And of course I want the whole way democracy works in the UK to be completely changed, but that's another issue. And this isn't just within the civil service, this is also within the police. We're seeing two-tier policing systems because of the incentives of not to look racist. Hell, we saw private security forces at the MEN Arena in Manchester not approach the Manchester bomber because they didn't want to be seen as racist. There are all these massive cultural incentives that need to completely change as well, but I can't see how that is going to change until you take away the power from the new elite. And a lot of the new elite are within these large British public institutions, including the BBC, including the Met Police, including the National Trust, for God's sake, and it obviously has to stop. There needs to effectively be a huge counter-revolution to take out all the Blairism within these departments. How exactly that is done, I don't know, but I think I give a pretty decent draft roadmap right there. Anyway, I really hope that next video I don't have to bring up protests for Palestine and Israel again, because I am really fed up of talking about the results within Britain of a war that is going on across Europe. But because these protests and these morons are not being policed properly, of course they are going to get bolder in what they do. You are going to see more fireworks, and honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if you end up seeing even more violence on the streets. Because at this point they probably feel like they can get away with anything. Anyway, that's everything I had for you today, so once again thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.